you want us to step out till you're ready?
Oh yeah, should do that.
Oh yeah, is the commissioner coming?
Heidi, it's Johanna.
Oh, he's great. Shouldn't, as long as your phone doesn't drop off.
Yeah, sorry about that.
See that? You're recording. I need to patch it out to everyone. A line check. Yep. Can you hear me? Testing 1 2 1 2 3. Can I hear? Testing 1 2 3 4. Testing testing. Hello. It's compared. Oh, there you go. All good. Do you want me to? Testing testing check. Can you hear? All good. Thumbs up when you can hear. Testing 1 2. Testing testing 1 check.
It's not going to stay, I think. Oh yeah. Like that?
Alright, one good?
Yeah.
Everyone good?
Yep.
So everyone, how you going? Good, 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 good. Oh yes, good, keep it. Well, it's a great piece of kit. Oh, it is a great piece of kit, yes. Let's go.
Let me know.
No, we gotta go.
Okay.
Alright, we're good to go.
All right, thanks. All right. Well, as we heard. Oh, maybe. Yep. You can't see the plane. Commissioner, do you want to see over? Come over here.
You come over here. How's that? Got
Yep.
the plane?
Perfect. All right. Well, as we heard from the Deputy Premier this morning, great news again this morning with 0 new cases in Queensland, and we're really pleased about that great effort that Queenslanders are showing. Well, I'm very pleased to be in Bundaberg today, and I'm here with the Treasurer, the Commissioner, and of course our Labor candidate for Bundaberg, Tom Smith, who is a teacher, and very much hoping that Tom can be part of our team after the election. So we're here today because we've got great news for Bundaberg, but also great news for Queensland. We know that Queensland was hit really hard by the bushfires last year. It had a huge impact, and several times we had to call on help from New South Wales and have the planes come up to Queensland, only to be turned around to go back to New South Wales. And of course we know that New South Wales was fighting fierce fires at the time. And what we realised is that Queensland needs to source its own plane. So today I'm really pleased that we have a 5-year agreement for the LAT plane. It's a Canadian plane which we are leasing. It'll be based here in Bundaberg. Now that is fantastic news because it could easily be deployed to Proserpine, down to the Gold Coast or out west as needed for the bushfire season. This means that Queenslanders can feel comfort that we have our own resource right here on our doorstep. During the last bushfire season, everyone was scrambling to get planes, and we've also seen the devastation that's happening in California at the moment as well. So our bushfire seasons tend to be worse, not better, but we need to be prepared. And today I'm very pleased to give Queenslanders a demonstration of the capability of this aircraft, but also to reassure Queenslanders that this capacity is based here and we put to very good use if and when it is needed. So it's costing us $15 million over the 5 years. And of course, It's a 10,000 litre aircraft as well, and will have permanently 2 pilot crew, and it has a 10,000 litre retardant capacity. So look, might hand over to the Commissioner and then the Treasurer, and Tom might want to say a few words, and then we're happy to take some questions. Commissioner?
Thanks, Premier. Good morning, everyone. Queensland Fire and Emergency Services is very proud to commission our new large air tanker to our fleet today. This is the 10th contracted firefighting aircraft we have here in Queensland, and it's the first time that Queensland's had a large air tanker capability. The crew have come in from Canada with the aircraft. They've undertaken their COVID-19 quarantine, and the aircraft's now commissioned and ready for action. It adds a significant capability to our fleet. The aircraft can hold 10,000 litres of water or firefighting retardant or firefighting gel, and it can be deployed anywhere within an hour of Bundaberg. It can be as far north as Proserpine, it can be as far west as Tambo, and it can be down on the Queensland-New South Wales border. It can fly at 670 kilometres an hour, and it has the ability to drop the retardant in a different pattern based on the needs of the incident controller at the fire. It's a very, very flexible aircraft, and it's a very welcome addition to our fleet. It's accompanied with a Turbo Commander lead plane. That aircraft's joined us from Victoria, and that gets dispatched with the large air tanker, and its role is to stand off and direct the air tanker in for the drop zone. It's about safety in the air. We take safety very, very seriously, and so that Turbo Commander is a very important part of the fleet. So these 10 contracted aircraft support the call when needed aircraft that we have right across Queensland, and it positions us very well for the upcoming bushfire season.
Say the bushfire seasons were as bad as last year's. How vital is something like this going to be?
Yes, so the value of this large air tanker is its ability to lay a retardant base in front of an oncoming fire. So we've got other aircraft that can do direct fire attack, but the advantage of this is it can put a retardant line or a line of water down in front of a fire close to a township or a significant asset.
Would you be willing to offer this to other states like we were offered in the previous bushfire season?
Indeed, so this aircraft's been sourced through the National Aircraft Firefighting Centre. It's contracted here to Queensland for a number of months, and when the Queensland bushfire season abates, this aircraft will move south into the southern states to support them for their bushfire season. But yes, all of the national aircraft are available depending on what operational activity is underway at the time. We could offer the support to other states, just like other states will offer their aircraft to us if we need it.
Comparing this aircraft to ones that other states have, does this have any extra capabilities?
This is a very flexible aircraft. This is the first Dash 8 that we've seen here in Australia in firefighting configuration. So Queenslanders will be very familiar with the Dash 8 aircraft. It's a very popular passenger aircraft here in Australia, but this is the first firefighting aircraft of the Dash 8 nature that we've got here in Australia. It has the ability to fly low and slow, so we've got the ability to direct the water where we need it.
You mentioned it came over with a Canadian crew. Would you hope that you could train some Australian firefighters to be able to use this?
Well, this is a Canadian aircraft under contract here at the moment. It's a specialist piece of kit, so not only do the pilots have to have the Dash 8 accreditation, there's also a lot of training and skill required for firefighting operations, so it is a very particular skill set.
Is there capabilities to train Australian firefighters to do that?
Well, there's only a limited number of pilots to fly the Dash 8 in the world, and so we're talking with the company about how we increase that capability.
Thank you, Treasurer. Thanks, Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner. Well, I'm so pleased to be here today to see this new aircraft arrive to support frontline services for the Queensland Fire and Emergency Service. We know that Bundaberg in this region came under threat from bushfires last year, and by having this asset come into the Queensland Fire and Emergency Service arsenal, it will help us fight fires. When I announced the Queensland Fiscal and Economic Review responding to COVID last week, one of the things we focused on was the front line and ensuring that we can back our fire and emergency service to have the equipment they need. Those firefighters to have the equipment they need is so important. There's no more important front line than a fire line. when communities come under threat from bushfires, and this will help respond. Within 1 hour, this aircraft can fly from Bundaberg north to Proserpine, west to Tambo and south to the Queensland-New South Wales border, ready to respond to help protect and save Queensland communities. And this is the sort of frontline service that will be put at threat by Deb Frecklington and the LNP. Just 2 days ago, Monday, was the 8th anniversary of Deb Frecklington and Stephen Bennett voting for the first Newman LNP government budget. And Queenslanders in the Bundaberg and Wide Bay region and across Queensland have never forgotten that budget. Some Queenslanders never recovered from it. And just last week, Deb Frecklington said she wanted to stabilise debt. Now, they were the same words that Stephen Bennett and Deb Frecklington used 8 years ago when they voted for the Newman budget. And what does stabilising debt means? It means 14,000 Queenslanders lost their jobs. And across the rest of the state, including the Bundaberg and Wide Bay region, Queenslanders saw essential frontline services cut, particularly health services. In this region alone, 807 people lost their jobs. 807 people lost their jobs because of Stephen Bennett and Deb Frecklington. And that included 345 people who worked in the Wide Bay Hospital and Health Service. 120 nurses and midwives lost their jobs. And no community was spared. Bundaberg, Maryborough, Harvey Bay, Gayndah, Mundubbera, small communities, Isbold, Monto, Biggendon, they all lost staff. People lost their jobs because of that. Now, I had a look at Stephen Bennett's website this morning. So proud is he of what he did. The budget speech that he put up, that he delivered in the Parliament 8 years ago, is still on his website. And in fact, he's got it tagged as the most important budget in a generation. 8 years later, he's still proud of that speech. So the other thing that Deb Frecklington and Stephen Bennett did last week, and David Batt, the member for Bundaberg, they backed in $23 billion of election commitments. Now, this is a party that said they're not going to increase taxes or create new taxes. They're not going to increase debt, and we made it clear we're going to borrow $4 billion over the medium term to fund frontline services and to support the economic recovery through our economic recovery plan. And they're not going to spend more than Queensland raises through revenue. Now, revenue's been smashed in Queensland over 2 years by more than $6 billion. So the only way that Stephen Bennett and David Batt and Deb Frecklington can fund their election commitments is by cutting, sacking and selling. So today there are serious questions that Stephen Bennett and David Batt have to answer about their election commitments. I can tell you now, there will be no money for the Money's Creek Lagoon unless they're upfront with the cuts they're going to impose on Queenslanders. There will be no money for the SES headquarters here in Bundaberg. There will be no money for any of those commitments unless they're upfront with the cuts. And they need to be very clear and honest with the Queensland community. We've made it clear we're going to borrow to keep Queenslanders in jobs, to get 130,800 Queenslanders back into work, to back in our frontline emergency services. So today I'm calling on David Batt and Stephen Bennett and Deb Frecklington to say, cut what, cut when, cut where, cut who.
How do you know that there won't be any money if the Queensland government hasn't delivered a budget this year?
Well, I've made it very clear what the fiscal position of the state is. Very clear. No other state in the country is delivering a budget. No other state until the federal budget.
How do you know that there won't be any money for any of these local projects?
Well, because we put the fiscal position of the state out there very clearly. We've said we will borrow to keep Queenslanders in jobs and to save jobs. Now, Deb Frecklington has said, and David Batt and Stephen Bennett, we're not going to borrow anymore, we're not going to raise taxes or create any new taxes, and we're going to keep revenue below, expenditure below revenue. Now, I released last week the Fiscal and Economic Review. Our revenue has crashed. It's dropped by more than $6 billion in 2 years. The only way they can fund their election commitments is by cutting, sacking and selling. And why do we know that? Because that's exactly what they did last time. They promised one thing before the election. They said no Queensland had anything to fear. They said no public servant had anything to fear. And then when they implemented their debt stabilisation plan 8 years ago last Monday, they sacked 14,000 Queensland workers. And that's what's at risk at this election, whether we're going to fund the front line or whether we're going to cut the front line. And we're going to back our fire and emergency services. We're going to back our nurses and teachers and doctors and police officers all across the state. And we're going to implement our economic recovery plan, the most comprehensive in the country.
On this aircraft, despite the obvious firefighting capabilities, does it offer any other benefits to this region, particularly economic benefits?
Well, of course, having an asset located here brings a temporary headquarters and brings a staff into the region to ensure we can have the capacity right here in one part of Queensland that was so badly threatened by bushfires last year. So there are always benefits from increasing frontline services. It not only helps deliver the services Queensland needs, but it also helps the local economy. All of those teachers and doctors and police officers and firefighters I've talked about, they spend money in the community. Many of them relocate to live in the community and then they back in local businesses. So that's why it's so important to focus on the front line and have a strong frontline response.
In terms of being fiscally responsible, how is spending money on polling for coronavirus sentiment an appropriate use of taxpayer money, given the response is not meant to be political?
Yeah, sure, if you want. Yeah, by all means.
Yeah, thanks. Look, every state does that. And for example, when people were in lockdown, we asked people how they were feeling. And because some people were going through a really tough time, we put more money into domestic and family violence services. And we also put more money into mental health. We also asked people, for example, about how they would feel about signing into restaurants. I mean, something they have never had to do before. But this sentiment is done across Australia. It's done by every state. And it's done by the federal government as well.
Won't this just help you with the election coming up?
No, it won't, because it's about how people are responding to the economic recovery. We had to put together a comprehensive roadmap to ease people out of those restrictions, and look how we're going. We've got a strong economic response because of our strong health response. I mean, we've had zero again today. The Deputy Premier has been able to ease restrictions again through the advice of the Chief Health Officer on the Gold Coast and Darling Downs. I mean, this is a tremendous effort by Queenslanders, and we can go about our jobs, we can go about our work, we can go about our lifestyle, because Queensland has had a solid response to listening to the Chief Health Officer on the health advice.
In terms of easing conditions,
Yes.
South Australia has reopened their borders to the ACT overnight. Will Queensland look at doing the same?
Look, we've always said we would look at that at the end of the month. I have raised some issues, and I'll continue to raise them at National Cabinet about ID around the ACT, and I'll be having a conversation with Andrew Barr, the ACT Chief Minister. We had concerns about lack of ID, and we will look at that very closely to see what provisions can be put in place for the ACT around the end of the month.
On South Australia this
Yes.
morning, they've announced they'll increase their cap on the number of international people coming into their state.
Yes.
So would Queensland do the same? And do you have a number of how many people you
Oh, look, I think it's look, I've actually been told some really concerning stories about people trapped, for example, in London. We've got an agent general over there. She's been conveying to me people are camped out at airports. They don't know what's happening, the uncertainty. They want to get home to loved ones as well. Of course, we've seen increased numbers of COVID in the UK. We've seen 10,000 cases of COVID in France in one day. So we are seeing now countries having not just a second phase, but a third phase of COVID. I think it's imperative that we get back to Australia as many Australians as we possibly can. So there's a couple of things. The first thing is the federal government can utilise its aircraft to bring people back, and they can set up accommodation for that. And of course, I've said very clearly, I mentioned to the Deputy Prime Minister, that I would be more than happy to look at taking more Australians here, where we have the capacity to do so, because I don't want families to be separated by very, very long distances overseas when they are isolated, and when a lot of countries are still in lockdown. Let's not forget, COVID is not over. Everyone seems to think, because we have zero here in Queensland, it's over. You look around the rest of the world. I mean, I saw footage the other night, I think it was on ABC News, where they are digging graves for bodies. This is heartbreaking. So we've got to look after people's health. My job is to make sure that Queenslanders are safe. The Chief Health Officer provides us with expert advice, and we will take that expert advice because we want to continue to see the great results we have here in Queensland. And that's why now we're able to focus on the economic recovery, as the Treasurer said.
Yesterday, the opposition said the Chief Health Officer is there to implement the policies of the government. Do you agree with that? And if so, why
The
not
chief
allow
health
more
officer,
exemptions for
the chief health officer is one of the most respected chief health officers in the country, and this attacks on the chief health officer has got to stop. I value her advice. I work with her very, very closely, and of course, we want to make sure that we can deal with issues as quickly as possible, and that's why we've actually increased the number of people into the exemptions unit, and we have put in place a specialist care unit as well in relation to hospitals across the border.
Is
Yes.
increasing the weekly number of people allowed to return from overseas to quarantine in Queensland something you're going to be looking at in the National Cabinet on Friday?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to do everything we possibly can as a nation, and I want to see Queenslanders come home as well. If they're trapped overseas, especially with the second and third waves that are happening, people are concerned about their lives, and I can understand that. We want everyone to be safe, and of course, we will do whatever we can. But the federal government has resources as well. The states have had to do the heavy lifting. They have assisted with quarantine with ADF, and I appreciate that. But there's a lot of resources that are needed, especially in making sure, especially with our police. Every time we put a new hotel up, there's extra police that are needed to look at those hotels as well. So, I'm quite sure that as a nation we can address these issues.
Would it go hand in hand then with state borders opening? If you're allowing more people in from overseas, would you allow more people in from interstate?
Well, no, that doesn't go hand in hand because they go into quarantine. And at the moment, we have our borders open to Tasmania, to South Australia, to the Northern Territory, and to Western Australia.
Premier, did the pollsters ask Queenslanders about border closures and whether they wanted them open or shut?
Ipsos, it is my understanding, has asked numerous questions across the spectrum on a whole range of issues that they have done with every other state, including the federal government. So it's interesting that Queensland's just being singled out here. But let me say this very clearly. Everyone just needs to have a cold shower when it comes to this, because every other state is asking a whole range of questions about how people are feeling about being in lockdown and coming out of lockdown.
Locally, there's
Okay.
concern about the impact of coronavirus restrictions on backpacker numbers. Yesterday we heard interim recommendations as part of a joint standing committee on suggesting that the Queensland government look at something similar to what's happened in the Northern Territory around bringing workers over from Vanuatu. Is that something that you're looking at and perhaps discussing this Friday?
Look, I haven't seen the agenda yet, but of course we have put in place agricultural protocols with other states. If it means people coming from overseas, we have to be very careful about that in terms of quarantine. Like I said, there's COVID in other countries, but we want to work together with industry to make sure that they have the workers that they need.
Just have a general question about quarantine.
Yes.
The whole quarantine system. Is it a matter of telling hotels, the government needs, to put these people here, or do they have to agree?
The hotels have to agree as well, and because we've run this Good to Go campaign, there are a lot of people who are actually travelling across Queensland and want to visit our hotels. Queensland's always been a tourist state. So what we are seeing, like I remember I went to Hervey Bay, was it last month or something? We had to ring around 3 hotels until we found a hotel that could take a booking, because everyone was coming there to see the whale season. So it has to be agreement with the hotels, but also too, there's a lot of resources that are needed, transferring people to the hotel, making sure they're doing the right thing, because don't forget, when you're looking at quarantine hotels, it's exactly what happened in Victoria. So we have to make sure that we have the world-class standard when it comes to dealing with this. But look, there's some other ideas that we have that we'll raise at National Cabinet.
Premier, how much money was spent on leasing of the plane and why wasn't it put towards purchasing Queensland's own plane?
Yeah, look, we looked at that, and it is the costs are just too much. But the leasing is a good idea. I said earlier on it was $15 million over the 5 years. But we actually had that situation last year where literally planes were on their way from New South Wales and had to be turned back. And we understand New South Wales was going through a horrific fire season. I'm not criticising that. But what I am saying is that now we have our own plane here. I'd written to the federal government about providing some extra resources. I was knocked back, but now we have our own, and Queenslanders can feel satisfied that if anything does happen, we can deploy this aircraft at a moment's notice. So, and it's great to have the crew here in Bundy as well.
And you can just provide
Last one,
an
yep.
update what Mike Casey has been doing for your government. Did you speak with him up?
Sorry, who do you mean?
Mike Casey?
I don't know who you're talking about, sorry. Okay, thank you. Thanks. All right.